Afternoon, everyone. We're really excited today to be presenting a very timely webinar entitled Operation Lone Star, Texas's Costly Attempt to Enforce Federal Immigration Law. This program is sponsored by the ABA's section on civil rights and social justice, as well as the Commission on Immigration of the ABA. And it's one of a series of rapid response webinars. We're actively working on additional programming, so please do check in regularly at americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on the programming. We're really grateful to the Commission on Immigration and the section on civil rights and social justice for putting together this particular panel today because Operation Lone Star is having huge impacts and has largely gone unnoticed in many communities. And so it feels really important to get the word out about what is happening with Operation Lone Star in Texas. We are going to ask you today to do any questions that you have, to put those in the Q&A function, not the chat function. If you're not seeing that, you just might need to jiggle your mouse and get your screen activated again. And we'll probably answer some of those sort of in writing as the program goes on. So feel free to post questions at any point, and then we will try to make sure that we have some time at the end to answer questions and have some back and forth as well. We are recording, so if you were registered for this, you're not here, but we will make it available to those who registered but who weren't able to attend today. We have an amazing panel today. I'm Denise Gilman with the University of Texas Law School Immigration Clinic, but I just have the honor of moderating a wonderful group of panelists. First, we will have Katie Dyer, who teaches in the Criminal Defense Clinic at the University of Texas at Austin School of Law. And then we will have Priscilla Horta, who has relatively recently taken up a position at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. She's Deputy Special Project Director there, and TRALA, as we call it here in Texas, has taken on a lead role in working on the Operation Lone Star cases. And then we have Claudia Munoz, who's co-director at Grassroots Leadership, a critical organization providing support and assistance to individuals and families affected by Operation Lone Star, as well as engaging in important advocacy on this program and many other issues that are impacting migrants in Texas and nationally. And then finally, we have Laura Pena, who is the legal director for racial and economic justice at the Texas Civil Rights Project, who has been deeply involved in challenging some of the problematic aspects of Operation Lone Star, as well as other work also. Before we dive in to hear from this wonderful group, we thought it would be important for me to just try my best to lay out a really kind of sketched version of what Operation Lone Star even is, since, as I mentioned, it hasn't been I think fully appreciated and understood nationally, or even in Texas for that matter. So really what Operation Lone Star is a Texas state law immigration enforcement plan. This is, clear in that it was implemented pursuant to an emergency declaration by the governor of Texas that was all about the border crossings and the statements by the governor and the executive branch of the state of Texas that there was a crisis at the border. The claim was essentially that the southern border is open and that is creating crises for communities on our side of the border. This is far from the truth, by the way. Just speaking from the border perspective, as well as doing work on these issues, there are a number of extremely restrictive border policies in place currently that result in most individuals at the border being turned immediately away from an immigration perspective. And in fact, the ABA has policies in place that urge the government to end programs such as Title 42 automatic expulsions, as well as the migrant protection protocols or Remain in Mexico program, which sends people back to Mexico to await asylum hearings in the United States. So despite the reality that there are a lot of restrictions on the border at this moment, the governor and the state of Texas decided that there was an issue that required a state immigration enforcement response, which raises huge preemption concerns. Typically, immigration law belongs to the authority of the federal government for good reason, because you wouldn't want every state to have a different immigration policy, even recognizing that there are multiple states just along the border, much less in general. But nonetheless, the state of Texas decided to go forward with this immigration enforcement program. And the program has, in the end, both criminal and immigration systems in place and consequences for those who are impacted. And other panelists are going to speak dive in more deeply to some of the significant due process and discrimination problems that are raised in addition to the preemption concerns that I highlighted. But quickly, just how does this program actually work? So basically what happens is that recent border crossers, mainly male, Latino, single border crossers, as well as Black male single men, who are found on the U.S. side of the border, on the Texas side of the border, even if they are asylum seekers, are charged under state law with misdemeanor criminal trespass charges. And then they're picked up by state level and local level authorities. And then they are shunted into a shadow criminal justice system where they are processed in a kind of parallel structure to normal criminal proceedings. They're sent to 2 large prison units that are typically used for individuals who've already been through the criminal justice system in the state of Texas, but they are sent there pre-trial to await proceedings before special judges and with a kind of parallel public defense that's set up outside of the normal criminal justice system. And then upon release from the criminal justice system, they are generally picked up by immigration authorities and put into immigration proceedings. So it does have that immigration consequence and ending to it as well, which was the stated purpose of it. They are put either into border proceedings for rapid expulsion or are put into immigration detention facilities and immigration deportation proceedings here in the United States. So that's just the quick overview of the backdrop that is before us as we talk about the issues that are presented by this program, as well as some of the advocacy that's underway to address concerns that have been raised. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Katie Dyer.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. So this is a really complicated topic, and definitely feel free to throw questions into the chat if something doesn't make sense. It is complicated. I'm going to try to break it down as best I can. But in short, about a year ago, March 6th, 2021, the governor of Texas, Governor Abbott, partnered with Texas state troopers, the Department of Public Safety, and the Texas National Guard to announce Operation Lone Star. And at that moment, to address the border crisis, and I'm putting quotes around that. And at that moment, we didn't know exactly what that meant. We started to get more clarity as the next month or two went on. At the end of May 2021, the governor issued this disaster proclamation. And what's important about the proclamation, and issuing a disaster proclamation, it frees funding streams for Governor Abbott to divert funds. And so the program, I just would have to mention that last March and April of 2021, 3 candidates entered the primary against Governor Abbott from the right. So there's 4 people running in the Republican primary, which I think is important to mention because there's a political element throughout this. And so, part of the governor's reaction was to amplify border, again, security issues to start this program. So by issuing the disaster proclamation, Governor Abbott asked counties along the border and counties not along the border to issue their own disaster proclamations in order to kind of have this free flow of funding that can come from the governor's kind of discretionary funding. Those kinds of funds had previously been used for things like Hurricane Harvey, the COVID-19 crisis, actual natural disasters that are also plaguing the state. But now that money is now being diverted to the border. Additionally, last summer, I would just note for folks that are not in Texas, our legislature only meets once every 2 years. So all state policy is supposed to happen in a few month period every 2 years. This year was that year, and the governor had a couple of emergency sessions that he convened the legislature. And very quickly, as this program started, the Republican-led legislature approved billions of dollars, up to about $3 billion to go towards security efforts and Operation Lone Star. So again, there's a very quick movement to give a lot more funding to this operation. And so, it's kind of at the behest of Governor Abbott who gets this money. So there's money flowing into these small counties that are very rural, that are very resource strapped and have every incentive to wanting to have a funding stream and build the system. There's also a lot of anti-immigrant toughness, political reasons that are being sold to these counties. So essentially, there has to be cooperation between the counties and the governor to get this funding for the state law enforcement immigration operation. So some counties have agreed to it and have had, this influx of DPS, our state troopers and Texas National Guard. Some counties have said, absolutely not, we're not participating in this. So there is a mix there. But what has resulted is that law enforcement has been diverted, down to the border. It already feels pretty militarized down there, and it's even more so now. So about half of Texas troopers have been kind of rotating through these counties. So all the rest of the state is kind of left without. And the Texas National Guard, that again had been focused on kind of, dare I say, like real disasters, real public health and natural disaster emergencies, are now being diverted there. So the resulting system is that there's been thousands and thousands of arrests that are 90% for criminal trespass, which means either being on some form of private property or state property or railroad property without permission. Criminal trespass is a crime that carries almost no jail time ever, and when people are arrested for it. And so we have thousands and thousands of people being charged with this very minor crime. And if they had any evidence of any other crime, they would be charged with something else. There's also very little evidence that criminal trespass has occurred. It's really, at best that there's some evidence that maybe somebody crossed a border, which again, that's federal jurisdiction. It's not supposed to be within the purview of the state criminal system. So people are getting rounded up mostly by a separate, right? Usually law enforcement is police and sheriffs and counties. And here we have, state level troopers making arrests. So separate law enforcement making arrests. When they're focusing on people that are men, they are not arresting for state criminal charges, women or families. So they are absolutely discriminating on the base of national origin, race, arresting people that have Spanish sounding last names and gender. And so they know that it's not politically palatable to arrest women or families. And so there have been specific directives, unconstitutional directives to target certain people based on gender, race, and national origin. So when those folks are getting arrested and pulled away, they are taken to a separate processing facility than people who are arrested for any other crimes in the state of Texas. They are labeled Operation Lone Star. They are taken to, Denise mentioned, a separate jail. It's not a jail. It's a state prison facility. And if you know Texas, you know their state prisons are getting sued all the time for conditions violations. The conditions are awful. And pre-trial jail, county jails have different standards that are much better. And so these state prison facilities are trying to get up to code, but they are woefully behind. The conditions are just awful. And so they're segregated from anybody else who's arrested in the state. Then they go through a court process that is completely separate. Oh, and I just have to note, these prison facilities that they're staying in are hundreds of miles from where they were arrested, hundreds of miles from where the case is being heard. And because of that, it is nearly impossible for people to, well, they're not brought to court in person. They're represented by attorneys that are hundreds of miles away that make collaboration and zealous defense almost impossible. And so, they are separated with very little information about whether they're in the criminal legal system, the immigration.
Little information about whether they're in the criminal system, immigration system.
Sorry, I'm having a glitch. Okay, thank you. And so, the other thing I just want to point out is there's not enough lawyers to handle the case on the criminal defense side. There's a struggle to get people representation. Some of the lawyers that are appointed to this aren't taking their obligations very seriously. There are many people that are incarcerated that have not talked to a lawyer, do not know when their court date is, have been in jail for months and months because with small counties, they are both woefully unequipped to handle the caseload. They're completely overwhelmed and somewhat intentionally okay with okay, I'm going to put this case, you were arrested on a case that would bring time served as a sentence and is almost always the offer is time served, but we can't put you on the calendar for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, over 100 days. The prosecutors are unable to keep up with charging documents. So there's laws in Texas where if you haven't been charged with a crime in a certain amount of time, you are entitled to release. They're blowing that deadline by months, and people are still in jail and they're unable to access relief and get released because they don't have a lawyer for that amount of time. Their lawyer it doesn't know what's going on in the case, can't get the case on the calendar. I've represented clients where we tried to raise an emergency writ of habeas corpus because they were entitled to relief based on this deadline issue and other constitutional violations. We couldn't even get a court date on the calendar without going to a higher court and telling that court to tell our court to set it on the calendar. So in terms of, vindicating rights, these small county, one example of a small county is Kinney County. They have arrested thousands of people. They haven't had a jury trial in 7 years. And now their court system is completely inundated with these cases such that they're not even putting them on the calendar for basic court appearances, let alone trial. And so I've taken a lot of time, but I do think I have to say that, the places in which, there's a lot of brave advocates that are trying to fight back and vindicate the rights of people and get them released and get them moving on so we can talk about the next piece, which is you get out of this state jail, you're not even, you're not walking out onto the streets more than likely. And we're going to talk about that. But where judges have done the right thing or followed the statutes or followed the law or determined the constitutional violations, those judges are often removed. So this is a separate set of judges that they brought in. They were bringing retired judges because the court systems were so overwhelmed. And when those judges were ruling in favor of migrants that were charged with criminal trespass, one of the county judges removed them from their duty and replaced them with judges that he thought would slow it down more and not rule in favor of people. So a lot to unpack there, and I'm happy to answer more questions. But the result of this is absolutely devastating, and we'll talk about it more. But these are people that are being arrested and not having an understanding of the process and held for months with no end in sight and no idea when this is going to end. It is not, I think, how people think jails and courts work in America. And I'm here to tell you it is happening in Texas. And it's a really devastating and scary time when we're talking about trying to use criminal procedure in a way that is fair. I will stop there.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly helpful to hear kind of the criminal defense perspective or the criminal justice perspective from somebody with as much experience as you, working in other kinds of cases that aren't set up in this particular manner. So no, it's incredibly helpful. Okay, so let's now try to transition to Priscilla. Whoops, did we lose Priscilla? I'm not seeing her for some reason. Shoot. Okay. Priscilla was going to speak to us a little bit more about how it plays out once individuals are over in the immigration side of things and are facing both sometimes ongoing criminal proceedings as well as the immigration proceedings. But we seem to have lost her. Am I right? Is anybody else seeing her? Okay, no. All right. You know what? Then we will take up Claudia, if you don't mind, which actually fits perfectly fine also, because Claudia was going to share with us some of the perspectives of impacted individuals and communities. And a lot of that is the immigration consequences as well as other aspects of the process. Yeah, thanks.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you, Denise. My name is Claudia Munoz. I am the co-executive director at Grassroots Leadership. We're a Texas-based organization working daily towards a safe and healthy present where people have agency over our lives and our lives are not interrupted by mass incarceration, deportation, and criminalization. So I just want to thank you for being here today. It's always great for a non-lawyer organizer like myself to be able to share space with attorneys and the legal community who have so much impact over the lives of many people. So thank you for being here and the work that you do. So I want to start by saying that my undocumented family has called Texas home for over 20 years now. We came here from Monterrey, Mexico, and up until last year, I also lived here as an undocumented immigrant. And I mentioned that because I really wish that I could say that the attacks on migrants are something brand new here in Texas. The truth is that we have been terrorized for many years. And for us, life has been a constant attack. Take counties, for instance, like Bastrop County, which is near Austin, where migrants are being pushed out due to gentrification in Austin, and where during the last World Cup, the sheriff set up a driver's license checkpoint right after a Mexico game. And that day, about 7 Mexican individuals were arrested by the sheriff and later transferred to ICE and deported. So you're probably wondering what Bastrop County has to do with Operation Lone Star, but the truth is that it has everything to do because, you know, Operation Lone Star is a much larger and state-sanctioned and well-funded version of what I just described. Operation Lone Star is definitely a political operation by the governor that basically weaponizes an already harmful, toxic, and racist criminal justice system against migrants. We know that Abbott has been planning and idealizing this for many years. It was first tried actually when Rick Perry was governor, without much success. But it's no secret that our current governor feels that migrant and other vulnerable lives are expendable for political pain and gain. So I think, you know, the human impact of what I've seen and our organization has seen since Lone Star officially started in March of last year, it's nothing like I've ever seen in my many years of community organizing. The harm, the heartbreak, the confusion, the violence that's being caused by this program is catastrophic to the thousands of people who have already been targeted by it. And I think for us, what this program could become, like the horrors that it could perpetrate, became really apparent back in June of last year when our rapid response hotline, a grassroots community-run hotline for immigrants, we started receiving a lot of phone calls from desperate and heartbroken family members of individuals who had come to the US recently searching for a better life and who were being arrested by the police and sent to prison in Texas. These calls came from all over the world, really, but mostly from abroad and some other parts of the US. And after those phone calls started increasing in volume, and the fact that it was pretty impossible to get any information from the Texas court system or the Texas Department of Criminal Justice system, a few colleagues and I, including Katie Dyer, decided to travel to Dilley, Texas, where the Briscoe prison is located, and then to Valverde County and Keeney County, where most of the people who were calling our hotline were being processed, just to see what we could find out. I think what we saw was more shocking and terrifying than any of us were prepared to see. In a town hall with the Zavala County Sheriff's Office, the county judge, Texas state troopers, and other law enforcement actors, there were dozens of border ranchers who were told that the best way to ensure migrants were deported and could never come back was to file criminal charges against them. From then on, many of those present at the town hall went on to call migrants animals, walk-in COVID cases, people of a different breed, and a myriad of other racially charged names that I won't mention to preserve my own dignity, but I'm sure you can imagine the things that were said during the town hall. After that day, and the clear racially charged tone of the town hall, individuals present were given specific and very questionable instructions, not only on how to ensure that they had charges to file, but also on how those charges could be enhanced against migrants. I think I and Katie and everybody present left that place just shaking in anger, but also just with a lot of fear of what was about to unfold for many more people. As we drove south that day, you couldn't go longer than a mile without seeing just heavy law enforcement presence from other states. So Florida, Iowa, Ohio, Galveston County, Montgomery County sent sheriffs and deputies and law enforcement to the border, and they were here all over Texas. And we know that the Texas border is usually occupied territory already. This was even like much more present. So during that trip, the attorneys that we traveled with really struggled to find any information about the individuals for whom we had names. Days later, information actually started coming in via the Keeney County social media, Facebook, etc. And we saw people being lined up and magistrated in a parking lot, and we learned that people were being forced to waive their rights to a court-appointed attorney. To this day, that reality has become even worse. So we know that the Texas border with Mexico is almost 2,000 miles long, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the tip of South Texas. And while this program only started in a few counties along that border, it has now extended to many other counties, opening our vast Texas, beautiful borderlands and counties to carry out this atrocity. The ones that we know that have the most activity to date or have expressed the most political support are Keeney County, Valverde County, Jim Hogg, Webb, Maverick, LaSalle, Zavala, and Zapata County, but there's many others that are participating actively in the program. I will say that as we receive calls from family members in our hotline, the first thing that many people ask is just what is happening. They say that the relatives, are familiar with immigration authorities. They know themselves as migrants and know the possibility of being arrested by immigration authorities. But they ask us why they were arrested by people in black cars, what the word trooper even means. And some families have actually expressed that because their relatives are not with immigration, they fear that somebody could have kidnapped them or sent to prison forever to be disappeared. So imagine how bad the situation is for undocumented migrants to think that immigration authorities may be safer than where they are right now. It's completely horrible. And I will also say that a huge difference between Operation Lone Star and other detention work that I've done with families is that most of the families of individuals arrested under Operation Lone Star are not in the country. And for that reason, it's much more harder for anyone to get a support system here who are currently at Briscoe or Segovia. So, our reality today, since what I just mentioned that happened back in June and continue happening through the year, is that we have many more migrant families and people from inside these facilities calling our hotline. The Segovia unit has capacity for 1,100 people. We know that there's about 400 people there. Briscoe is usually pretty filled up as well. And we know that Lone Star is being expanded by the day. So I just want to tell you about, just what we saw at Segovia, because Katie and I came down here to meet with some people yesterday. And these all started because about 3 months ago, we received a phone call from the relative of a person who was at Segovia for 2 months at the time. We connected with them, helped them find who their attorney was. Our role is really to accompany people and figure out advocacy points. As you can imagine, this process is very confusing, especially for those who are not here or just came here. So we try our best to explain what's happening and break down system for people. So when this person called and said, my relative has been at Segovia for 2 months, we helped that person connect with their court-appointed attorney, and we just left it at that. We thought things were moving. But a month ago, that same person called again saying that the relative was still there and still hadn't seen an attorney. By now, it's 4.5 months that their loved one was there. So we asked the relative to pass on our phone number inside Segovia. And I mean, ever since that day, the phone will not stop ringing. We've connected with maybe over 50 people, but out of those, we were able to visit 20 people who were all in the same situation, who have all been at Segovia for over 120 days, and who haven't, who have no information on their cases. They don't know what's going on, haven't been able to talk to anyone about their immigration case. A lot of the people that we actually met with yesterday told us that they felt forced to take a plea and to take a deportation, even though that's absolutely not what they want, because they fled their countries, a lot of them fearing for their lives. And so it's absolutely heartbreaking. As an advocacy organization, we were able to raise money for bond to pay some of their bonds and to see if we can help some of them get out. But just the scope and the impact of this program that, as Katie says, prosecuting thousands, it's a lot. It's very heavy. It's heartbreaking, and it's just absolutely horrendous to see what is happening. And I think the last thing I want to leave us with is that we have done a lot of advocacy at the federal level. Right at the end of the day, if the federal administration wasn't cooperating with Texas in some way to have a lot of these people deported, this wouldn't be possible. But what is happening, what these families are telling us is that most of their family members are immediately, after they've endured months in a Texas prison without any information, they're then sent to immigration authorities, and they're just being deported, most of them. And so we have asked the administration over and over to please not cooperate. Some of these individuals are also being charged with illegal entry and re-entry, and just put suffering on top of suffering. Unfortunately, the Biden administration hasn't been very responsive. They've told us in closed meetings that this operation has put them in a position where they say anything negative against it, it's almost like they are speaking badly about law enforcement. So they're not going to take a strong stance on this issue or stop deportations from happening. And so we are doing everything we can. Lone Star is definitely building up and increasing the budgets, infrastructure, reach and scope of border sheriffs, DPS, and other law enforcement entities. Abbott doesn't want it to stop with Texas. We've seen him go to different states and advocate that they start a similar program. And so I really just thank everyone for being here. Please get the word out of what's happening. And there's many ways to plug in to help stop this. So if you're able to do that, please do get involved.
Claudia, just before we move on, and that's a great segue to have Priscilla come back in and talk about the immigration side, but just you listed out the counties involved, and everybody's been asking about that. Could you do it one more time? And there is a map to the overall state of Texas. We'll do another one in a minute, but if you want to kind of click on that as Claudia is talking about it, you can get a better visual and follow along.
Yeah, of course. So there's about 48 counties that have signed up, but there's a few that have expressed either the most political interest or have backed this program, or that are arresting the most people. Some of those are Kinney being number one, Valverde, the first one that started all of this. The newest one to open a processing center is Jim Hogg. And then Webb, Maverick, LaSalle, Zavala, and Zapata counties are where we're kind of seeing a lot of political activity or a lot of DPS and law enforcement presence along the border.
Well, and that was actually the next question I was going to ask you, especially since you and Katie are down that way right now. Aside from the impact in individual cases, what does it sort of feel like along the border? Can you share with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will say that the first time I came here and went back, literally a month after, I got shingles. a little too much information, but I think my body just went into shock. Like I said, I was an undocumented immigrant for 20 years. My family's still here undocumented. And when you actually see, I mean, you couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't go to the gas station or restaurant anywhere without seeing law enforcement from literally all around the country and all around the state present. It is a scary reality. It's a reality that we know that Greg Abbott is trying to implement in other places and to like put in place for the long term and the long run. And just seeing how all of these people are given all this money, all this infrastructure. We couldn't find hotels. We needed to help some migrants get to hotels. There were no rooms available. It's all literally taken over by DPS and law enforcement. And yesterday night, as we're driving towards Valverde today, we had to stop in Carrizo Springs, which is it's in a different county that hasn't even been part of these conversations. But we also couldn't get a room or anything. And we found out that it's because DPS is also heavily present here. So I think even in some places that haven't even been mentioned, it's occupied territory. If anybody's able, like, please drive down to any of these counties I just mentioned, and you will feel it in your body, because this could be a reality if this is not stopped anytime soon.
Thank you for that. Okay, Priscilla, do you mind leading us into the next part of the conversation?
Yeah, sorry about that. It got really dramatic very quickly with my computer. But I do think that's a really good segue. So first, I like to start off by saying, what Claudia is describing is really just a ramp up from the daily lives of everyone along the border. So I want to put this in a little bit of context. In some ways, as I sit here in Cameron County, I'm about 4 miles from the bridge. That's what daily life is like here to begin with. You have CBP, you have massive presence of law enforcement, even without Operation Lone Star. And I think what Operation Lone Star, though, does is just add more and more numbers, and specifically in counties that are very low population density, right? So it does become occupied because they're the only ones there. So I do think that taking a drive along the border is really important. And in fact, it's what I do. I drag all my friends here. If anyone from Chicago is watching, y'all have come down here and seen the border. And this is why. Start in Brownsville, head over to Kinney, and start to see how different it looks and feels. And I think that is a really important point. And I'm glad that you brought that up, Claudia. Hello from Chicago. Yay. Okay. So now in terms of immigration, this is where things get complicated. I have been doing basically only immigration law my entire career since 2011. And even before that, I was a paralegal. And I don't have answers. And that's the point. The point is, I think, to exhaust people to where they will not file their claims, or they will be unable to file their asylum claims. There are a proportion of people who are coming and they're very honest with us and say, look, we came here for work, we'll go back. Those are largely Mexican nationals who will typically interact with CBP after they've pled or after they've paid a bond, and they will be Title 42'd and sent back to Mexico. So I don't want to make it sound as though there aren't people who, every single person's an asylum seeker. They're not. However, they are being trapped between various processes, and they're being forced to either, a lot of them have not been declared guilty. A lot of them haven't had a trial. They haven't, heck, we can barely get them into court. They're paying their bonds, they're getting out, they're being deported. And now how are they supposed to go and handle their criminal cases? We are trying to make sure that they have Zoom, that they're, we're attempting to get people paroled, but we're creating double systems, putting people in positions where they're being forced to go and explain themselves in court when in fact they haven't done anything wrong. There aren't any signs. There is no actual understanding of how this is supposed to work. I think it's really important. Somebody brought up that women are not being targeted. And this is a very real thing as well. I've been reading some cases wherein 3 men were taken straight to Briscoe and the woman in their group was sent back to CBP. So what's happening then is that women who may have claims for asylum, and if any of you have ever worked with women who are fleeing Central America specifically, we're talking about horrific claims of violence, specifically against women, of rape, of daily beatings. They are being unable to bring their claims because they are being sent straight back to CBP, and the majority are being Title 42'd. So another point that was really brought up and is important to note is that all I can do as a Padilla attorney is when I'm talking with folks after they've paid their bond, they're still in proceedings, we're still representing them at trial, I can't give them a straight answer. I don't know if they're going to be Title 42'd. I don't know if they're going to get a CFI. I don't know if they're going to be deported the next day. I have absolutely no idea. We can barely find our clients. We have people who have bonded out and we have been told that they are out. And in fact, they have been lost in the system for months. Briscoe is not telling us that they have been there for 5 months after paying bond. We are only finding out due to advocacy, due to people like Claudia, due to family members finding us, begging us to tell them about their family member. So we are operating under a system in which even if somebody has a good asylum claim, and even if I prepare them for a CFI, and even if I help them in that process, who's to say they're even being transferred to ICE to make that claim? And so it is more dangerous, in my opinion, as someone who has been doing this work for a long time, who has seen the inside of some terrifying detention centers. It is, in my opinion, that this program is actually more dangerous and more terrifying than putting our folks straight into an ICE facility. I've never lost anyone in an ICE facility. I've never had ICE lie to me for 5 months as to where my client was. So this is a situation that we are facing here along the border. In terms of getting people through the process, we have people who have gone through, they paid their bond, they were sent directly to ICE, they made their asylum claim, and they lost their asylum claims already because they had no representation. They are getting stopped because they aren't being able to get attorneys. I'm going to give an example of a client who I spoke to last week. And he said, well, abogada, if you're an attorney, you know, that's how they always start. It's never your name, it's always abogada. And he said, the thing is that they tried to call the attorney, but they would call her at 2:30 in the morning. They called his attorney twice to help him with his CFI at 2:30 in the morning. And then when the attorney wasn't available, they said, do you want to keep doing this? He really wanted to plead asylum. And so he did his asylum application there and then at 2:30 in the morning with no representation, with no one to help him and no one to know where he was. He was found not credible. He was found not to have credible fear. And when he went to the judge just stamped it all blanket before I could even talk to him. So I am not sure, of course, what is going on between CBP, ICE, DHS, all those folks, and Texas. But it's not as though the Biden administration is even attempting to make the process more fair or accessible for these folks, even knowing when they have attorneys who are willing and able to represent them, just not at 2:30 in the morning. So that is generally what's going on. I'm really happy to take questions or if you guys want to know more details, but if I sound a little upset or if I sound a little panicked, I've only been here doing this for like a month and I've seen things here in 1 month that I haven't seen in a decade otherwise. And that is deeply, deeply disturbing.
Thank you, Priscilla. That is awfully troubling. And just to be clear, because we're using, what's a CFI? I think you explained a little bit, but.
Sorry, when I get into immigration, I just start throwing out the acronyms. A CFI is a credible fear interview. It is the very first part of asking for asylum. In this interview, you have an asylum officer on the phone asking you questions about why you came, how you came. The bar is supposed to intentionally meant to be quite a low bar because obviously people who are just arriving to this country are a little traumatized. And as you can imagine, those who've spent 6 months in Briscoe with no food, no change of underwear, no toothbrushes, they too are a little stressed out. So the idea is that you ask a person why they came, let them explain in a non-adversarial environment. And the vast majority of people are supposed to make it. That's the purpose, because we don't want to send people back to their deaths. We want to give them a full chance to have a full hearing with representation if possible. So that's a CFI.
And to be clear, just from the kind of immigration perspective, the credible fear interview is conducted by DHS specifically.
It's by DHS, yes. It's by DHS, and it's supposed to be happening at the ICE facilities. Some folks are saying that they're happening at CBP. Unfortunately, Border Patrol offices are sort of like black holes, right? If I can get their cooperation, a lot of attorneys that I'm working with are calling and getting a hold of them. If you can get their cooperation, they'll talk to you, but it's not, they don't have to, you know, and if they're not in the mood, they won't. So, yeah.
And the reason I point that out, that these are DHS officials, federal agency immigration officials who are doing this, is several questions have asked about the extent to which the Texas Operation Lone Star entities are cooperating with or collaborating with the federal immigration entities and vice versa. And I think this kind of sequence of how these cases play out demonstrates that there is some level of cooperation, that at least the federal government is going forward with deportation proceedings against individuals who have already been through Operation Lone Star and who have been brought to their attention through Operation Lone Star. The federal government would
Absolutely.
have a whole range of options as to how to handle somebody who had already been through this egregiously problematic process that wouldn't necessarily involve putting them into detention or deportation proceedings at all, much less requiring them to pass a credible fear screening interview in difficult circumstances. They could be allowed to rejoin family and pursue asylum affirmatively in the United States outside of the context of deportation, but that is not currently what is happening.
Yes. And from my understanding before I joined, one thing that was happening more frequently that I have not yet seen happen again is that those who had claims while they were detained in Briscoe, in the criminal side of it, in the Texas side of it, if you would file an application for asylum, many of them would actually be paroled and allowed into the country because they had representation, because they still had pending cases, and we had filed the applications. That does not seem to be their MO anymore. So Katie's got her hand up. I'll let her take it because she probably remembers more.
Yeah, Katie, do you want to go ahead and jump in?
I just wanted to chime in that even in situations where ICE detainers have been lifted, that doesn't stop Texas law enforcement from dropping people off at Border Patrol and other to other immigration authorities that happily accept them. So in terms of, we're still trying to figure out what that direct coordination is, but it's absolutely happening that ICE has said, we're not interested in pursuing this. And yet somebody ends up with Border Patrol or in immigration proceedings anyways.
Right. So just to clarify that piece for those not deeply immersed in immigration speak, ICE is sort of on the more interior side of Texas, and Border Patrol is at the very border. And what you're saying, Katie, I think is either way, there is some collaboration happening, because either ICE picks up and puts into the regular detention system inside Texas, or people often end up back in Border Patrol custody and facing very automated, expedited border deportation proceedings as well.
Someone in the question and answer did ask, what is the specifics between the state and ICE? I have to tell you, we would love to know, right? I don't know if there's specifics. I don't know, Katie, if you guys have ever found any. There appears to be a pattern, but that it's not a guaranteed pattern. I've gotten the sense that it's changed a lot, and there may be directives, but we don't have, at least I don't have them. If anyone does have them, please email me them.
Great. Okay. Katie, did you want to add anything there? Okay. So let's turn to Laura to talk a little bit more about what is being done, how these various problems are being kind of categorized. A number of questions have asked about how are we going to deal with the preemption issues? How are we going to deal with the race-based issues and the rest? So if you could help walk through that, that'd be great.
Sure, thanks. And I'll probably start with one of the questions in the chat posed by Mike, and that is, where does the supremacy clause fit into this? And it's a little bit of the politics that Katie started us out with, but it's also just a strategy, very similar, in my opinion, to the state of Texas and other states, multiple decades long attempt to undermine Roe v. Wade. We have a similar attempt to undermine US v. Arizona. And so that is the case that's found that immigration law, that's the federal government's lane, right? And so it is under federal immigration law that the federal agents are able to implement, execute immigration law, not the state. The dissenting opinion in US v. Arizona, I think it was Scalia and Thomas, they really focused on, well, we're going to weigh in with the majority here. However, it's really critical that when there is overlap, that overlap, there must be a conflict. There must be a clear conflict between state and federal execution of these programs, right? So whatever the state program is, and then the federal immigration law. And what we're seeing here, as just the last 10 minutes, high levels of confusion between what the federal immigration authorities are doing and Operation Lone Star and how the state is executing it. So there's from my opinion, there is no one litigation sphere that is going to topple Operation Lone Star. As a state collective, you see Claudia here, we have advocates at the tables with attorneys. We have criminal justice experts like Katie, who are going out in the field, who are understanding the nuances of the due process violations. You have immigration experts like Priscilla, who are at the seats with the public defenders who are being assigned. And then you have organizations like mine, the Texas Civil Rights Project, the ACLU of Texas, Texas Fair Defense Project, Immigration Law Resource Center, several organizations who are then looking at the legal analysis and determining how can we go at this. So our most recent, in December, we filed a complaint with the Department of Justice. It's a Title VI complaint, alleging that Operation Lone Star is discriminatory. It discriminates based on race, and it discriminates based on national origin. And so that is one first big attempt to plead with the Department of Justice and the Biden administration to intervene in this illegal program. So we'll just take two very elements. You know, the topic of this panel is a wasteful expenditure of resources. So I'll talk a little bit about the money, and because I don't think anybody has yet. So, you know, in order to file a Title VI complaint, there has to be federal funds that are being appropriated to programs and activities that are allegedly discriminatory. And so federal funding from the Office of the Governor to the Texas courts, to Texas Department of Emergency Management, and some over $1.7 billion of federal dollars get funneled into the state of Texas, plus an additional $1.85 billion in CARES funding. That is from our research. There's likely more. We know there's an additional millions of dollars that are funneled from the federal government directly to counties that have signed up for Operation Lone Star. On top of that, the Texas legislature has appropriated $1.8 billion over 2 years, just 2 years, for border security. And Operation Lone Star in this particular migrant arrest scheme is a big part of that. I will share my screen in a bit. Somebody had a question about the counties. Claudia mentioned the counties that are currently arresting migrants, but there are many counties that have declared a border disaster and that will likely be receiving funds to build jails, to target individuals in their communities, even if they don't go the full extent of this in terms of arresting and prosecuting migrants. All right, so shifting briefly, we're okay on time. I'm gonna shift to our evidence. I'm gonna get it a little into the weeds, but not too much, and I'll try not to repeat some of the great information or helpful information that Katie and Priscilla and Claudia have already shared. So we focused on direct, and this is what a Title VI complaint requires. You can either have direct, indirect, or outcome-based evidence. And we have a little bit of all of that. So in terms of direct evidence of either race or national origin discrimination, we have tons of statements from Governor Abbott explicitly saying that they're creating a separate state system to penalize migrants. All right, not to uphold the rule of law, to penalize migrants, people from countries that you have never even heard of. That's what they're doing. So we have direct statements from Governor Abbott, and it goes all the way down to local officials. And that's a more benign statement. All right, Claudia mentioned some of the earlier statements by local officials where migrants are referred to as animals. You know, there was a Facebook posting in one of the county sheriff's page where they likened migrants to deer that needed to be shot. This is the level of dehumanization and racism and animus that is fueling Operation Lone Star. Let's talk a little bit about unlawful arrests and some of the state dysfunction. I'm not going to go into this because Katie covered quite a bit of it, but I think one really important point is the lack of probable cause. In so many of these cases, so many cases are dismissed, and just one example of lack of probable cause that I don't think anybody has mentioned. You know, thousands of dollars, probably at this point millions of dollars, have been spent in building fences along ranchers' private land. So ranchers have an incentive to get free fencing for their property. And you have National Guard building these fences. Why are they building these fences? Because the code actually has a notice requirement for criminal trespass. Okay, so millions of dollars spent putting up fencing. Then what? Then they send National Guard, sheriffs, you have folks from Iowa, Florida. You know, so you have all this law enforcement posted up by these new fencing. And so when migrants are trying to seek protection, they are actually often waved to a particular part of the border, asked to enter through an open gate so they meet the notice requirement for criminal trespass. At that point, sometimes, you know, different experiences, but at least one story that I heard, you know, an individual was waved through, they told them that they had water for them, lured them into this particular area of land, could call it entrapment, and then they called the DPS or whichever law enforcement entity is conducting the arrest that day. So clearly unlawful, clearly lacks any merit. These are bogus, fabricated, expensive, racist charges. And so that is one thing that we explained very thoroughly in our complaint to the Department of Justice. So you also have outcome-based discrimination, outcome-based evidence that highlight discrimination based on race and national origin. Reviewing arrest records. In December, we had our complaint. We just filed the supplemental complaint. So we get arrest records, we review them, and we analyze them, right? And so when reviewing the arrest records, reviewing the affidavits, when they do have them, right? Because Katie talked about cases being, not having appropriate documentation. Of the arrest records we reviewed, about 98% of the individuals apprehended are identified as Hispanic male, 98%, and 2% Black male. In certain counties where we've been reviewing the arrest records, about 50% of the records also include perceived ethnicity, national origin, immigration status. So you have language like Spanish males, Hispanic males, UDMs, undocumented migrants, non-citizens. This type of language that you have the immediate impressions of the arresting officer, and he or she is documenting them in these records. So, reviewing the records, analyzing them, and looking at the percentages, and that's really some of the outcome-based evidence that we're providing to the Department of Justice and asking them to conduct an investigation. I'm going to talk a little bit briefly, and then I'm actually going to share a map that I have. So separate, one of the underpinnings of civil rights is that separate is never equal. And Katie talked a little bit about how the system is different, separate. Priscilla also mentioned this. And this is a really important point. Not only is this system rife with violations, but it is a separate system that's intended to harm, that's intended to punish, that will never, never, never be equal. This is why at the heart of it, it violates Title VI, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So if you look at the delays in criminal proceedings that Katie was talking about, failure to file charging documents, a prolonged detention, months in detention without even knowing if you have a lawyer, substandard detention conditions. You know, when you talk to somebody and they say, I'm really hungry, and they're not feeding us regularly, and I see the commissary, there's Doritos that other people can buy. I can't buy Doritos. I can't buy toothpaste. I can't call my family like other people can. And that is based on their citizenship. It is based on their race. That is separate. It is unequal. This is why it is illegal. I will end with our evidence of extreme anti-immigrant animus. And we've been monitoring vigilante and militia activity. You know, Claudia, I didn't even know you got shingles, you know, a month after visiting, but that makes total sense. The level of vitriol in some of these counties is palpable. It is palpable, and it is coordinated with militia groups that have been involved, in some cases charged, with the January 6th insurrectionists. So there are clear linkages between the people who are trying to upend our democracy and the people who are trying to target, harm, impact the border here, and trying to create those alliances in local counties. And it goes all the way up. The Texas Lieutenant Governor, you know, he stated as one of the reasons for Operation Lone Star, one of the justifications, is that if you're talking about thousands of new voters, right? If all of these migrants have 2 children, you're talking about thousands of new voters, and that this is a part of a silent revolution by Democrats without firing a single shot. A real fear that's being instilled in border counties, where that fear in the past has not been at this level. Yes, racism, anti-immigrant animus has always existed, particularly in Texas. We are seeing it at a heightened level. We are also seeing residents of these counties feel afraid, feel silenced, feel like they cannot speak out. And so this is another element that we are monitoring, that we're extremely concerned about. The rhetoric of an invasion, you know, the drumbeat, we've seen that have consequences in the past. The mass shooting in El Paso of 2019, you know, that manifesto was about the invasion, and we see the same language, the same rhetoric feeling it. Those are my main comments. I'm just going to share this map to show you the counties that have joined the border disaster. So this is a map of Texas. And at the top, this is Throckmorton. This is nowhere near the border, but Throckmorton, for some reason, believes that they have a border disaster. So they've joined the state's border disaster. All of these counties with an X have agreed with Governor Abbott that there is a border disaster, and they will be getting likely funding. Now, the main counties that have been prosecuting Valverde, that Claudia mentioned, that's here in the corner. It's in the arm. I call this the armpit of Texas. So lots of activity in the armpit here, Kinney, but then you come down to Jim Hogg. And so somebody who's arrested in Valverde, this is a very long drive. So you're having, law enforcement transport individuals hundreds of miles, like Katie said. So I hope that's a helpful demonstration of some of the counties that are participating in this scheme.
I also think your map is really important, though, Laura, from an immigration standpoint, because the 3 counties that see the most immigration, aka the counties that may have the most to declare, are Starr, Hidalgo, and Cameron. And Willacy, it's not quite on the border, but it's right above us. Notice that they have not signed on. This is not about an invasion of immigrants at all. Because if it were about a disaster, wouldn't the places where the most people cross be the ones first to sign up?
Thanks, everybody. Incredibly helpful. So there are some really good kind of questions in the chat. I have several that I'm going to kind of accumulate up and pose. And the first one is just, so how do the law enforcement authorities know that these are migrants? So we've been saying over and over that they're targeting migrants, and specifically Latino, Latinx migrants. What is happening, if you can kind of describe that? And I guess I'd ask, this hasn't been directly posed, but as a corollary, are there non-migrants who are getting caught up in this? And anybody who wants to answer, why don't you just take turn.
I'm going to answer the quick one. They don't know that they're migrants. They're using racial profiling. We have already examples of people who are either U.S. citizens, long-term residents, who are getting caught in the program because they made the mistake of driving through Kinney County. So racism, that's how they know.
Does anybody else want to add anything to that?
I mean, I could add for citizens, the legislature has taken up some and some laws have passed to expand crimes such as human trafficking or human smuggling to loosen the requirements. And so, there are a small number of U.S. citizens, as mentioned by Priscilla, who are prosecuted under non-criminal trespass charges or criminal trespass plus other charges. So we do see some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this also just ties into what Claudia was describing in terms of the overall feel of the border currently, because if it is the case that state and local authorities are engaging in profiling, then the sense that creates for the entire community has to be one of fear and of being constantly vulnerable to that, regardless of immigration status, and certainly with additional consequences for those who don't have immigration status at this time.
I did want to modify a little bit what I said, because one of my dearly beloved coworkers, Billy, gave me some facts. He is our statistics man. He put together 8% of folks are U.S. citizens, and only of those, something like 2 of them are being charged with criminal trespass. They're putting other charges on them. But it's very interesting. The entire statement I just said, if they're all criminal trespassing, why are the U.S. citizens being left not charged? And if it's so easy to tell who's a migrant, why is almost 10% of the people involved U.S. citizens? That's a lot.
And just to clarify, Priscilla, that would be of the cases, not all cases, the cases that Trala has, your organization.
Right, the cases that Trala has. And to be fair, for a long time we had the bulk. Yeah, we had quite a few. It's not like 1 or 2.
Right. And of course, knowing that the demographic along the border in those counties is heavily Latino, such that profiling is going to have an impact on a very large segment of the society and doesn't make much sense in terms of making any distinctions between members of the community. Okay. Anybody else want to say anything on that? The other big question that came up was, sort of, who do we sue? How? What causes of action? And I wanted to invite Laura talked a little bit about this with the civil rights complaint and also some discussion of the preemption issues. But I thought it might be helpful also for Katie to talk about what's happening kind of on the criminal defense side to bring in some of those larger constitutional and statutory issues. And if others have additional thoughts about strategies that might be pursued to achieve the greatest impact, whether that's involving the Department of Justice more directly or other avenues for pursuing a change. Katie, do you want to start?
Sorry, was that kicked to me? It cut out for a second.
Yeah, if you could talk about kind of the types of defenses that are relying on some of the statutory and constitutional violations kind of on the criminal, in the context of criminal defense as a way of attacking issues with the program, that'd be helpful, I think, as a starting place.
Sure. And I'm happy to have folks from Trala jump in that are filing kind of a bigger writ strategy. But, I touched on the fact that, there's Texas statutes that are being violated and the kind of procedural hurdles that are keeping people incarcerated that absolutely are entitled to release. Beyond that, there's challenges. We're raising it at the state criminal level. The preemption and selective prosecution, so that these are discriminatory arrests that we get to challenge from the criminal defense side. The problem with it is that that's one case at a time. It's one client at a time, and it's trying to get judges to hear substantive constitutional arguments when the reality is most people can barely get a court date to enter a plea of not guilty. And so the real struggle is that because of the absolutely unconstitutional delays in this process, so many of the clients are like, I can't just sit in here for a year while we wait for judges to hear these cases, to hear both sides, to make rulings, potentially, for the cases to be appealed. And so, we're absolutely raising, probable cause issues that people are being targeted without the requisite level of suspicion in the criminal legal process, kind of vindicating those constitutional rights. But the reality is that the practical process is such that, it's really hard to ask someone to sit in these unsanitary, awful conditions and say, I have no idea how long your case might go on for. So I think the criminal legal process is one that people are trying to exercise, but I think it falls short of being able to really challenge this operation.
Priscilla, did you want to chime in from the Trala perspective?
Everything Katie says times 100. I'll give an example that happened 5 minutes before we got on here. At 10:50 a.m., I got a phone call. My number is now circulating through Segovia, my personal number. This could have happened a dozen ways. I'm not even offended. It's part of my life. But the point is, they have figured out that I'm no longer just an immigration attorney, but also working with the criminal defense attorneys. And so I'm getting phone calls myself personally of people giving me names, and I'm very confused. And I ask, how did you get the number? Oh, so-and-so told us that you would answer. These are families who have people that have been incarcerated for 140 days and haven't even spoken to their public defender. Trala is not the public defender for them. I wish we were. I wish we could. I wish there was a way. And I effectively have to tell people, I can't even really talk to you. I don't know. I don't have any information. You're going to have to call the attorney. So the process is literally, this is for a misdemeanor trespass charge. Like, I am not a criminal attorney, but I'm pretty sure that 150 days is way outside the bounds of anything that's normal for this. But if people want to do something, instead of just watching me like break down into a million different pieces, what I would do is in fact contact Union Pacific Railway. There are people who are involved in this. Union Pacific owns a ton of land out there. A lot of folks are either on trains near the railroad tracks because they know that it's a place, they know it's going somewhere in the interior. And so they follow it. And Union Pacific is 100% cooperating as of this moment. They are cooperating and working with Kinney County and other county officials to implement this process. Without Union Pacific's cooperation, quite a few arrests would not happen. You would be downgrading, downscaling what's happening. So if people are listening and they want to know, what can we do? We're figuring out who to sue. Honestly, if y'all have ideas on who to sue, I mean, sure, we'll take those up too. But another way is to reach out both to the corporations. Reach out to Union Pacific. Why are they participating? They don't have to. They're under no requirement to participate. Anything we can do to get even these ranches. Somebody asked, how do we know who's filing these charges, who's cooperating? It's in the complaint. They name the ranch. They name the ranchers. That's public information. You should be able to get a hold of that and, say, ranchers, why are you doing this? These are things that non-attorneys who want to get involved, who want to fight back, these are some places to start. But I especially think Union Pacific is a great place to start.
That's helpful. And I was going to ask about who the landowners are. But before we get to that, in addition to Union Pacific, I do want to continue to follow up on this set of questions around, kind of what could the litigation look like? And Laura, I don't know if you want to follow up further on, kind of where you're hoping the Title VI complaint will go and getting the Department of Justice involved and what they could do, or if others have thoughts on the viability of other types of civil actions or impact litigation.
Right. Well, the manual, the Department of Justice manual on Title VI complaint does require that when a complaint is filed, that the department and issues are raised, issues of discrimination are raised connected to programs and activities that are federally funded, they're required to investigate. So back to an earlier point, advocates, lawyers, we had professors, law professors write a letter demanding an investigation. We do believe that the Department of Justice intervention is going to be extremely necessary in this case. It takes time. But we just saw, the Attorney General make a very, what I found, moving statement after the results of the Ahmaud Arbery federal hate crimes trial, right? And so it does take the Department of Justice time, but they do have the tools necessary to launch an investigation and hold officials accountable. So that is why we've chosen this particular tool of filing the Title VI complaint with the Department of Justice. It also positions the Department of Justice to have some neutrality within the federal government as it relates to what the Department of Homeland Security is doing on the ground. That's another benefit to taking this particular legal strategy. That being said, all the lawyers love litigation, and so we have to prepare our legal research. And so there are several claims. I mean, violation of the Supremacy Clause, federal preemption. Just one of the reasons why this is starting to come back to U.S. versus Arizona, the Supremacy Clause, it preempts, federal law preempts state and municipal law in any area over which Congress expressly or impliedly holds exclusive authority, right? And so in the immigration context, as it relates to Operation Lone Star, there was no passage of new laws. I mean, there were some small ones, but this is enforcement of state law. And so it makes it a little complex. And that's why going to claims such as violations of equal protection rights, additional claims like that, discrimination based on race, based on national origin, are potential viable claims as well. And so we have not, our strategy as a state, a collective, is multi-pronged. I do not, even though I'm with the Texas Civil Rights Project, we are legal advocacy. We do also believe that there's a critical element of a cohesive strategy that includes advocacy, that includes pressure on corporations like Union Pacific. I've been directly involved in those negotiations. And then on the ground, I'm also this is not exactly tied to this, but there's been a lot of frustration with the Texas military and the deployment of 10,000 troops. And this is not voluntary deployment. This is mandatory deployment of troops to the border. High levels of depression, suicide rates. The troops are not appropriately funded. They do not have appropriate access to benefits, whether it be medical care, access to food. And high levels of frustration within the Texas military. And so that's been coming to light more recently. People are noticing that high levels of frustration. So there's elements of, how this scheme is being implemented that I believe are ripe for advocacy, both legal and policy and just straight up organizing.
Thank you. All of this is incredibly helpful. So last question, because we're nearing end in time, but I do think it would be helpful. We've spent a fair amount of time talking about who the federal actors are, who the state actors are, and who the county actors are that have willingly signed up for this. And Priscilla brought up at least one landowner, Union Pacific, that has been involved. I think it might be helpful to give those listening and watching a sense of who are the other owners? Like, what does this look like? Claudia described a kind of very challenging moment in a public meeting with landowners, but if there's anything else that you can give as a sense of, because even if a county is involved, you still need a particular landowner to be involved, at least as a willing partner in allowing the criminal trespass charges to go forward. Can you all speak to that?
I'd love to start.
Katie.
Yeah, so I think, a lot of swaths of these land are agricultural use. So they're kind of huge areas that are owned sometimes by a corporation, sometimes by a company, sometimes by an individual. And so the county officials, the county sheriff has done a lot, county sheriffs in many of these counties have done a lot of fear mongering, talking about how dangerous this stuff is. And then, like Claudia said, encouraging landowners to get involved, to sign affidavits that allow for these officials to go onto their land, to look around for people. So, some of these places are places where there's nobody on the property. And yet there's been a lot of talk of, violence and a war, an invasion of people's lands, such that even, the sheriff of Kinney County has even kind of backtracked and been like, oh, I don't understand why people are so afraid. And it's because of the rhetoric that they use to encourage people to cooperate with basically just allowing any law enforcement on their property. So again, these are, kind of big swaths of mostly agricultural use land, which actually, if you are accused of criminal trespass on agricultural land, that's a fine only Class C misdemeanor, which is basically like the level of a traffic infraction, because again, these aren't properties where people are walking by someone's home. They're just very large agricultural use or non-agricultural use pieces of property. So again, it's a lot of the government officials really encouraging a sense of fear to get this cooperation.
Does anybody else want to add to that? I mean, there is an interesting kind of tension here, right, between the idea that these might often be political allies of the executive branch, the governor of Texas and the like, at the same time, traditionally often holding a position of not wanting law enforcement on their land because of strong senses of private property. And so there is a kind of a dynamic here that changes the norm a bit when it involves immigration enforcement. And so thinking about that dynamic, I think, can be helpful as well. Yeah, Laura?
Yeah, there's another dynamic that is also, I'm still trying to work through. And historically, whether it be farms or ranches, have relied on labor in order to run their business. Labor from individuals without documentation. And you have that, but then you have this rhetoric and they say, oh yeah, well, you know, a fence was broken, right? And then, or, you know, minor infractions to their property. And so you have this rhetoric, but it sort of cuts against the economic need for individuals to help run and sustain their business on cheap labor, right? So it's a difficult topic to talk about. You know, we've been talking with individuals in rural communities to understand, just from the residents' perspective, how these messages are resonating with them. And so we don't have a perfect solution, but we are noting that there are a variety of tensions here and contradictions.
And one story just to illustrate that, which is just hit spot on. Recently, I came across in one of the hundreds, if not thousands of cases Trella has, I saw a person who was part of a group of 4 workers who was actually working on another ranch when they were pulled over, and they all fled because they were all undocumented. So they figured it was ICE and they were in deep trouble. They had been working on another landowner who just a week later, I saw 5 or 6 people that were on his land who he was claiming as trespassing, even though these undocumented laborers had just left from working on his land. So like, it's a little bit confusing. It's like, so on the one hand, you'll employ them, but on the other hand, you also want them detained on your land. Are they invading or are they working? Are you trying to avoid paying their salary, or are you actually afraid of an invasion? Like, there's a big tension.
So Texas is complicated, and the financial costs, as this panel focused on, are complicated. Going from everything from the actual expenditures on this parallel criminal justice system to potential loss of labor force that is critical to the finances, the economy of the state of Texas and beyond. Let's hope that the complications of Texas are not spread to other states, because that is a real concern, I know, of many of the panelists, that this model that has been happened upon might actually be exported and copied elsewhere in places like Arizona, making it all the more important to think about ways that this program can really be addressed and brought to an end. We probably better end the program now. The listeners have been very gracious to stay with us for this full time, and we really thank you for joining this webinar. Again, I think we all feel that it has been critically important to get some information out there about Operation Lone Star. And I really want to thank the esteemed group of panelists. All of you are doing critical work, and we really thank you for taking the time out of your schedule today to share your experiences and your expertise. Again, the Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice is providing additional webinars like this one for legal professionals and advocates nationwide, and we hope that this one helps your work and that you'll come back and listen to other programs as well. Thank you, everybody, so much for being here today. Really grateful.